We are lighting the candle, a world that works, and we're going to do an abbreviated session today that's going to be a proton powered pill for all of you out there. We're going to feature a conversation between me, I'm Bill Correll, and my buddy at Jan Jeremias. And we're going to talk a little bit about communication, and maybe at a different kind of a level than we have before. And in terms of setting up that conversation and what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes, Jan, have you listened to a podcast recently that really made an impact on you?
Yes, I have, Bill, and I shared it with you. It was from the Wolf We Feed podcast, or the One You Feed, and it's based on the parable about, the good wolf and the bad wolf and the Native American parable. And in the podcast, I'm just getting the title because I want to get the exact title. It was called Oh, no, that's not it. Sorry. It was called How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. And it talks a lot about communication and connection with other people, and, this basic need for us to be like, it's hardwired into us to connect, and the necessity for good communication. And so a few things that he shared, and I guess I hadn't really thought about it, like, it kind of struck me as he said it. And I was like, oh yeah, was one that no innovation and invention would have been created. Like, we wouldn't be in the progression we are now, let's say technologically, or a lot of the advancements, is that if there hadn't been communication, because most of the time those were formed out of collaborations and previous research. And it was all based on being good communicators. And that is our ability to communicate, really differentiate. Well, that form of communication, let's say, differentiates us from a lot of other species. I think they have different communication skills. Not belittling those, because I think sometimes they're far superior to ours. But
less words sometimes, right?
But definitely, we do have a way of communicating with each other that definitely can advance us and move us forward in technology and in other advancements. But he just talked about, what we need when we go into a conversation or we make a connection. Like, what are we looking for, and how can we do that better, basically? And that, I think it is a learned skill. So that's why I'm always very intrigued by those types of things, because I'm always looking to improve and excel at how I communicate with people.
Yeah, and the communication that you and I are talking about is not where we wait, our turn to talk. It's at a far different level, where there's actually an exchange of ideas that are fully understood by both the sender and the receiver, such that the receiver can now say in different words after saying in the same words what the thought is, so that it's not necessarily just parroting back, here's what you said. It's more along the lines of, here's what I understand that you've said, and I'm saying this in my terms now. Does that resonate with you? So there's this whole, it becomes a dialogue that is for construction purposes. It's not just to impart information from one person to the next. It's to actually have those ideas continue and live on in the other person, in their speaking and in their own lingo.
Yeah. And I think if you're not looking, every, let's say, conversation or connection is meant, can be meant to move that relationship further along into maybe a deeper relationship. So maybe it's not, practically speaking, in the fact that all of a sudden a new idea is going to come forward. Maybe it's just that the relationship is going to become stronger, and those two people are going to become more connected and navigate the world, if they're a couple or they're partners, in a different way. But, he does discuss that, a whole idea of what you mentioned just now, Bill, which was this whole idea of, like, are you just parroting what someone said? Or when you repeat it back to them, are you basically saying, this is what I heard, is this what you meant to say? And am I understanding what you meant correctly?
Yes.
And just that whole idea of saying those words makes the other person feel heard, makes the other person feel understood. um, there is this whole other level of communication or connection that happens versus if someone just parrots back to you what you said and then you think to yourself, well, they just have a really good memory, because they remembered what they reiterated what I said verbatim,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Well, it's guilty as charged for me because I'm able to do two or three things almost simultaneously. And that is also to be able to listen to what a person is saying while I'm having a really cool, daydream for myself, and then be able to give them back exactly what they said to me. But that is really kind of the booby prize in a conversation, because if there's not a transfer of understanding, then really there's no value to the conversation. There's no value to the speaker. Why is the speaker sharing with you? To see if there's value in your receiving it. And if you receive it with value, it does so much in terms of validating not only the speaker and the listener, but as you're saying, that relationship now has more of a connection to it. And the more of these little connections together, it's like the old Jewish grandmother who says, you get a little string here, a little string there, and then before you know, you can't break that for nothing. You can never break that for nothing ever again. And that's what we miss these days from folks from the old country. And that's why if we were around people who were like first generation immigrants to the United States and listen to them talk to themselves and talk to other members of the family, they almost have a shorthand because there's such a cultural understanding in how they all were raised together and experiences and conversations where you have these little things, like you might say something in terms of what one of your children said when they were 3 or 4 years old 40 years later, right? And my wife and I do this all the time. We have our own invented language where when I say something to her and I say "Harinada," you know, we both know what that's referring to. That's like "have a great day," right? So when you were saying something else too that I kind of heard Ben Shapiro say. I've heard 3 different levels of this conversation that I just want to share for you, just so we can kind of model how that went. One was from Charlie Sheen on Two and a Half Men, and he basically did a little seminar and saying, "I understand." To anything a woman said, just say, "I understand." So he had this like 5-minute conversation with this woman who was very, very angry, and all he did was just looked her in the eye and said, "I understand." And so that's one level. Number one, did he understand? I don't think so. I think this was a survival tactic that he picked up somewhere along the way, and the writers made it kind of funny. And then Ben Shapiro is another guy that I like to listen to because he and his wife had structured these kinds of conversations where she would say something to him and he would judge by the volume of her voice whether or not it was appropriate to make a contract on what kind of conversation they were in, simply because he didn't want to waste anybody's time and get it wrong, right? So he would open by saying, "Okay, hon, is this one of those conversations where you want me to listen to you and do something about it? Or is this one of those conversations where you just want to vent and have me sit here and get it?" He said, you'll never know how much peace that brought to the family by making that agreement before, she had an opportunity to, and it set up my listening so that I could actually bring those skills to that particular conversation. And oh, by the way, I listened the same way. However, I made it clear to her that I was ready to listen how she needed me to listen in that moment. So there's a third level that you talked about before we got on here that goes even beyond that. I think that you came away from in your conversation, and that is the next level, which is how do you want me to listen, and that's the Ben Shapiro thing. And then the last one is then what then do you need from me that I can provide, a unique contribution to you that I can make, as your partner in life or as your partner in this conversation, or just somebody who cares about you and really wants to see you do well. And that's what I kind of brought away from our little brief 25-second conversation before we got on here.
Yeah, and I think that, I was telling this to someone else because well, when we got on and we were kind of just chit-chatting before, I said, he was talking about, I guess, something teachers were taught, and that is when kids come up and need their, and need their attention, the teacher turns to them and says, okay, do you need me to hear you? Do you need me to help you? Or do you need me to hug you? And I just loved you. I loved that because I know we're both huggers. So I loved that. But just this whole idea of like going into a conversation and maybe like in a setting, you can't like go up and hug somebody. I mean, I know that you would differ with that, Bill, but I mean, the majority of the population might
Guilty
not.
as charged.
Yeah.
I may have hugged. It always was appropriate because I always asked permission first. Okay.
Right. True.
Without getting too deep into the balance of power and all that other kind of stuff that I had absolutely no use for while I was trying to help my people be the best they could be, But you're right. Hugging, I think, is a very valid communication because I don't know how to impart like pure energy to another human being quite as quickly as you can in a 4 or 5 second embrace, just to like, have that momentary thing. So that's, if you shake my tree, you're going to get my peaches, right?
Right. And so, but I loved that idea of going into a conversation with those words in my head, just something as simple as that I was going to remember.
Yeah.
Hear, help, hug. It's 3 words, all that begin with H. It's not very hard. So I was like, oh, okay, this is really simple. And I was talking to my mom actually, and she said, well, and I said, it's not like a conversation. A conversation evolves. So it's not like you can sit down. And at first I said, I'm sure that a lot of times I need someone to hear me. That may move into help kind of thing, or that might move into, okay, well, now I need a hug. Actually, after I've gotten what's on my chest off my chest, I now need a hug. So it's not like it's stagnant. Like you do a conversation and it's like, okay, you heard me. Now we're done. It's like, okay, it's complete. I'm done. I feel good. Sometimes it is. Sometimes all you need to do is vent. I used to be like that. I didn't want anybody to help me. When I was, with my ex-husband, I didn't, when we would have conversations, I didn't need help. I wanted to, express what had happened to me during the day that, was hard or whatever.
Sure.
And I think that if we can kind of go into a conversation with that as at least a baseline, there's one, I know that coming from a female, like I would get annoyed when he would try to help me. I didn't want help. I really just wanted to be heard. So it kind of, like I would just be like, because after that, then I turned off because he wasn't giving me what I needed. So the conversation in my head ended, at that point. And then the other thing is that this way, at least you're prepared to give the person what they need, which is something you mentioned in the conversation.
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to strengthen the relationship is like, okay, to provide the person with some sort of either it's support, practical insights or practical tips. Let's say if it's help, or concrete help, if that's what they need. I need you to, can you take mom to the, I feel overwhelmed. Can you take mom to the, to this location, like practical help?
Right.
Or do you need to just vent?
Yeah. I mean, when you have that little, 15-second contract conversation at the beginning, it's always available to be upgraded too and changed, but at least you're starting to speak in the way that you want the person who's with you to listen, as opposed to, I think most guys, and we always talk about this. I mean, this goes back to, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, right? And the really interesting part about that is that the male hierarchy, dealing male to male, is all about give me the information that I need to make this moment stronger, better, faster, complete. Okay. And then get the hell out of my space because I got other things to do. Right. So that's how, all the love that gets shared between guys back in the 1970s and 80s. But when women would come in, they weren't really thinking in terms of a structured conversation that had rules and guardrails and boundaries and that sort of thing. They would just start expressing. And more often than not, it was coming from emotion and sentiment and that sort of a thing in terms of how they were speaking and that kind of language. And the guy's trying to listen for the action words, the things that are logical. What can I take away here? What can I immediately give you that's the answer that if you just weren't so emotional, you'd figure the damn thing out for yourself and then get the hell out of my space because I got other things to do, right? That's where all of the conversations used to lead to. So now we have a generation, and if the kids are learning how to do this, hear, help, hug. Can you imagine what this world could look like by the time they're all in 5th or 6th grade? If they learned how to authentically, bring that into their conversations with each other and their conversations with folks at home.
I mean, we would move along, I think, progress and just general happiness. Overall happiness.
Right.
I think, we share a lot of some of what's happening now, or a lot of what's happening is that feeling of isolation. So I think that lack of communication or quality communication, let's just put it like, and so all of a sudden people don't communicate and there's no one to have a conversation except with yourself. And right. I think that can be a very, in some ways, a very dangerous place. So much of what we tell ourselves is false, isn't true. Like the beliefs we have, the messages in our head, like all the stuff, the dialogue, it's also repetitive. So we tend to get on a track and keep going with the same track and not be able to cut it off. I call that like the emotional or mental cul-de-sac. It's like, we go around in circles. And without anybody else to kind of sometimes do a pattern interrupt,
right?
We get stuck there.
Yeah. And while you're saying that, a couple of things that come to mind for me are, the implicit hierarchy of the situation, depending on who the speaker and the listener, who those folks actually are. Are we talking about in a relationship between partners? Are we talking about a relationship between parents and children? Are we talking about a relationship between folks out in a business world, vendors, customers, that sort of thing? And what it really all comes down to is that we've gone through about a dozen years of people being told, you don't have to worry about how you sound to everybody else. It's their job to figure you out. Okay. And that's really destructive. If you're someone who wants to see a community grow strong and have some kind of direction, where people are heading the same way and they look forward to seeing each other, you can't tell, 1,000 people your truth doesn't have to agree with everybody else's truth. Don't you ever give up on your truth. Okay. Like there is a your truth. Okay. The your truth that you have is that thing that you bring that's unique. It's not something you dominate other people with by keeping them guessing what your truth is. And so we're now finally getting back to where this pendulum is swinging the other way. And it's coming back to, yes, if you know a little bit more about yourself, bring that to the conversation. And yet, Stephen Covey said it best. Listen first, to understand and then to be understood. And if you'll be in conversations in that order, it may seem like sometimes you have to listen to stuff that you A, already know, B, have an idea of how it's going to end, and C, is taking up your valuable time because you got other things to get to. Okay. We all seem to have that out there. So when you're in a situation now where there are some really well-trained conversationalists out there and communications experts, and the linguistic part of it, words and the choice of those words sometimes is the least important part of it. Sometimes it's all about hearing the emotion, which is, or the delivery of the words, and then coming back and asking questions about the language afterwards. Do you know what I'm saying? So that you can get on the same wavelength from an emotional standpoint or from a sentimentality standpoint, or just at least get the two left brains sort of working together before the right brains have to come in and then, wordsmith the language. And if you can get to that point where we both think enough about each other that we are not going to be hanging on every word and our understanding of the definition of those words, we can come back and we can say, well, you mean like this or you mean like that, and then get to that point where there is some exchange of understanding, which I think anybody who's dedicated to communication will say getting your point across is the booby prize. Being understood in the way that the person who understands it can explain it back to you in their own language or in other words or to other people in their language. Wow, that's where we start to communicate.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a few different things of late because I've listened to a number of podcasts that I've really enjoyed. And, and I just personally find it very interesting. And I've started to look at the words people use when they describe something or when they are speaking, because our choice of words tells a lot about us. And obviously there are many different words with similar meanings. So the choice of words sometimes is very indicative to the way someone feels or operates, how they navigate their world. And then the overuse of certain words for certain people. Like,
Yes.
and it's always interesting to look at like a word which you don't maybe throw around so easily and other people's overuse of that word. And so that's always really interesting to me. The difference in where, possibly where that comes from. Because I think that tells a lot about a person. And so if you could look at having a conversation with someone as not only a conversation, but an opportunity to really get to know someone versus an agenda.
Yeah. I like what you're saying there, and I encourage you to stay with that. Okay. And maybe kind of tease it out a little bit, because
Well,
the whole notion of being in a conversation with somebody until it's over, you know what I mean? As opposed to being in a conversation where there's a genuine commitment, both sides, to exchange positive energy or to create something new, even if it's just a momentary set of goosebumps or something like that, where why wouldn't you want to have every interaction with another human being that's going to take time out of your life? Why wouldn't you want that to be memorable? And if it's going to be memorable, why not be positively memorable because you created an instant with each other that was never there before? I don't know. I'm a wacko, and that's kind of how I think. I want love to be present all the time, but I don't want the love that you and I show up together with what we thought love meant before we got together. I want it to be the new love that we invent together in every conversation, that, oh yeah, later on when you're thinking about it, yeah, you start to get the chills in your arms and elbows. And, kind of like when you're doing the cool down with yoga and you do the neck rub. I get goosebumps every time I do that, doing yoga. Do you do that?
yeah, and I think that there is that there that it's almost like this process of what I like to think of as like a commingling.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, if you want to use food analogy, it's kind of like sitting letting something marinate versus just throwing something. And I'm a vegetarian, so I'll use tofu, but it's just like throwing tofu on the grill. And basically, tofu doesn't taste like much unless you marinate it in something.
Right.
It doesn't. It takes on the flavors of whatever you put it with. So if you let it kind of sit, and yes, and it is time consuming, and sometimes and we all are busy and we get distracted, but
Yeah.
it's so worthwhile.
Well, I can tell you from my own personal experience, the 2 week trip that I took up and down the East Coast, actually down the East Coast and then back up the East Coast again, I kind of got myself into a groove with whoever I was with and whoever came into the space to have the moment be special. You know what I mean? Not a special that I brought to it, but a special that we created in the instant. And in a lot of cases, I documented how special it was by taking pictures of it. And then, of course, doing what I do because I'm Bill, I posted them on Facebook, right? And what was so neat about it was clearly by the time we had 3 or 4 of these interactions posted on Facebook, sometimes it was with people I'd never met before, but half hour, 45 minutes later, it was like we were old friends. We hugged each other goodbye, for God's sake. These are businessmen in Morganton, North Carolina, who I meet at a wings bar or something, and we're hugging each other goodbye. But I'm getting outreaches from other friends on Facebook saying, if you're going to be in this part of the world, make sure you come see me or I'll never forgive you, Bill Correll.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that depending on your background and how, in some ways, and I don't want to group a whole type, like a type of person into, a category.
Right.
Let's say I'll categorize myself. Okay. I can categorize myself. So here I am, very type A, very driven, and I tend to have an agenda. Like I have a to-do list, I have an agenda. I used to look at conversations like that of like, okay, this is the agenda. This is what I expect out of this conversation. And this is what I want out of this conversation, for example. Now, there's two downfalls to that. One is when that doesn't get fulfilled or the conversation or the interaction doesn't go like that, I'm disappointed because it didn't unfold the way I wanted it to unfold. So that's one. Two is how limiting is that? Because in my head, I've already had that conversation. I've already come up with the questions. And it has nothing to do with the other person. It's all about me. It's all about what I wanted. So all the questions are one-sided because I'm a planner. So I sat there and I might have even jotted down what I was going to ask based on what I wanted to get. And I'm not saying I don't jot down ideas or something, just, as triggers kind of thing. But it's so funny because now I look at it and I think to myself, well, how limiting is that? Because I haven't even interacted with the other person. Like I could probably sit in front of like 10 people and have the same, then have the same scenario come out, which is so skewed and sort of, I want to say almost, I used the word evolution earlier. It's kind of like stagnating.
Yes. Well, if you stop and think about it, you didn't need a partner in any one of those conversations.
Not one.
There was no value created by having those words exchanged. Okay.
Exactly.
So that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. You live that life for a while, and you become the limiting ceiling on what you can actually create and the people around you. I did the same thing. Okay. I know exactly what you're talking about. I speak worse than you the same language, right? So the fact of the matter is that it becomes very apparent to people that you and I were not interested in, anything other than hearing ourselves make noise around them and having them nod their head so we could go on and do what we were already planning on doing anyway. And what I really think, what I'm interested in hearing, is so then what?
Right. Exactly. Well, then there is no, you leave and either you stop communicating because it doesn't serve any value. So or eventually you catch on and you finally, you do enough self-reflection, enough talking to people, with the right people.
Yes.
you realize how much can be gained from having a conversation
Yes.
where there's an actual exchange of ideas, energy, emotions, either that or you realize what lack of communication has done, like, in a relationship, in the deterioration of a relationship. We're working on chapters for the same book, Faces of Grief.
Yes.
And in mine, I actually talk about communication. And that was one of the, and I think that's key, it's a key to any relationship. I always say, and then we're always communicating with ourselves. And so how do we do that?
Right.
What are we saying to ourselves?
Well, so you just triggered two responses in me. The first one was I was thinking in terms of conversations. I think when I started to grow as a manager, slash mentor, was when I started learning how to ask questions that couldn't be answered with a yes or a no. Where I was either seeking discord or accord, consonance or dissonance, or I wasn't really looking for other information, but I didn't know I wasn't looking for other information. When I started asking the other 5 words, like who, what, when, where, and how, never why is a fool's errand in my you get an answer and you think the conversation's over, so why is a dumb one. Who, what, when, where, and how is I think a very good way to go in terms of trying to flesh out some kind of a new thought. But while I was having that thought in response to what you said, so you and I are both writing a chapter in the same book, which we are. And I'm thrilled to death that that's happening and you're going to be in there. And B, you reminded me I have a deadline for getting my edited draft, back to Sam and others, to complete because I got it while I was out traveling around. And of course I didn't really retain too much in terms of what I had to do when I got back. So thank you for those. That's like an upgrade in my conversation and a to-do that I didn't remember that I had that I now have to get onto.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I was I was thinking about with this whole idea of communication was, you were talking about when you got that idea. And one of the things, and you started to ask questions that were not yes or no. And in that podcast, he actually goes through that. And he actually gives a few really good examples, like you meet somebody who's a doctor and basically you say to them, where do you practice medicine? And basically there's only one, there's one short answer that can be like, oh, this is, I practice in this area, kind of thing. And much more interesting questions might be of like, oh, like, what do you specialize in? And why did you go into that? Yep. Like something that's a little bit more elaborate and not. And he said, sometimes, the conversation or the avenue you're working just really purely, that person does really not want to go down for whatever reason. Like they don't want to have a conversation about that. When you ask how their mother is and they say fine, then, you could explore it a little bit more, but if after another question, they're kind of like still with that one, and there might be a topic they don't want to discuss, their mother or whatever, and it might be time to explore something else.
Yeah. And when having a networking background and being kind of a wacko myself, I cringe when I hear people refining their 30-second elevator speech. And when somebody asks me what I do, it's like you're going to ask that same question to 40 people today, and you're going to walk out the door and not going to remember a damn thing about any one of us, okay? So I started coming up with what I would refer to as smart ass answers for that, which basically was, what do you do, Bill? Well, whatever it takes. Okay. And it's everything that's called for, and then whatever's called for to make things better. So um,
I love that, by the way, Bill.
yeah. And I'll tell you what, I mean, that really is if I were going to have something tattooed on the inside of my forearm, it would be those two words: whatever it takes, in two words. Okay. It takes being one word and whatever being the other word. But the point is that um, I don't know what I'm going to do next, and what I've done in the past might be interesting for me to tell you about, but the specifics are what are interesting, not the generalities. I do cloud based telephone systems and networks. Boy, that's really freaking exciting, Bill. You must love doing that. I mean, everybody I know that does that is really, they have like a great life, right? No, it's like, so when you run into somebody in the science world, like, what interesting things you've been working on lately? What challenges have you got going on right now that you're really stuck with? Those kinds of questions are better networking questions for two reasons. Because number one, when you leave, if they don't remember your name, they're going to remember who you were. They're going to say, hey, big guy, he's got a beard, he's kind of a pain in the ass in terms of, asking questions and stuff. But yeah, no, they can find me because there's enough other people at the networking event who know who I am. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And now, first of all, I love that about the networking. I think that's a great, because you're so right.
Yeah,
And it's sort of like I feel the same way when people approach me, let's say on LinkedIn, and send me messages, and it's
right.
automatically about what they do. And I'm much more interested in who they are, and are they really, and how they want to know me. Like, what do because so much of the time it is purely like they want me to like buy their services and I don't know them. And so I'm like, sorry, I know 1,000 people that, can help me with my website.
Yeah.
And you have to make me, basically you have to work for my business. You have to work to get to know me.
Yes. And I'll tell you what, people do business with people that they know, like, and trust. And that's true with giving business referrals. And if one of those three isn't missing, you're probably not going to have a real strong commercial future together, which is why everyone who wants to short circuit, and have their charisma at the first meeting kind of blot out the fact, that they're in real estate. But yeah, I know, Bill, you've got 75 other realtors that you've known over the years. And of course, you're going to do business with me because I'm sitting here being cute for you or whatever. You know what I mean? And sorry, guys, it doesn't work that way. It works by having a relationship where you have communication and where you succeed and fail at that communication, where you make promises and you don't keep them, but you come back and oh God, yes, I do owe you that, and I'm going to do it. And then you do it. You make it good. You make a new promise, right? Those relationships tell people how you're going to behave in the future if you and I bring them our friends who we know, like, and trust, because I don't have anybody in my world that I don't know, like, and trust. You know what I'm saying? They're
Mm-hmm.
all my friends, and they're my friends from now on, not just for a transaction, and not just until they're done listening to this podcast.
Absolutely.
From now
Absolutely.
on. Yes.
Forever and ever. Uh,
Yes. Amen.
yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about kid conversations all of a sudden because we started out talking, and I'm just thinking because I've spent quite a little bit of time lately around, little ones, and I just the way they converse and they, interact with peers versus, adults necessarily, um, with each other. It's very interesting because there is a level of understanding, like, just that happens very different than adults. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you what. Um, what I would like to do, because we're coming up to the 45-minute window here, maybe you could give an example of what you're talking about. Either something that recently happened or just some kind of an idea so that the listener could get a little more richness out of what you're giving, because I think I think it's great.
Not even sure. I've watched the way, and maybe it's not only conversation, I think it's interaction. That's there's a lot more giving in conversation. And what I mean by that is like, I've spent a lot of time around my brother's grandkids. And so they vary in ages and their ability to kind of work with what the conversation where it is really unique. Like if if one of the little ones wants something and they don't talk much anymore, their ability to kind of just show them different options of like, oh, okay, well, do you want this or do you want that? And it's not in a, I want to say, in a belittling, accusatory, anything negative kind of way. It's just like, oh, well, I'm not sure what you want. So let me give you options and let me be kind about it and loving, kind of thing. So it's just been like, as they play together, year and a half year old or 2 year old who isn't speaking much anymore. And then a 4 or 5 year old who's like, or maybe older, who's quite articulate at this point,
Sure.
and they're playing with a toy, and it's just like, when you go through, my brother was a grunter, didn't really communicate much. It was just like and he would point, kind of thing. Body language, so they use body language really well. Um and it is in a and there is a silliness that goes along with it, like, when they finally get it right and they start to laugh. So there's that also. A lot of times I think that we come into a conversation and, you know, depending on who we are, we're far too serious and intense. And, it's sometimes like if you don't understand somebody, maybe it's actually, you look at it as an opportunity for humor versus, an opportunity to get, whatever, negative or upset.
Yep, because it's far too important for that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is far too important.
Well, great. Anything more?
No. Practice conversation. I mean, I think we live in a society where we tend to, a few times lately, I would, going back and forth in text with people and everything, and finally just picking up the phone and saying, this would, this would actually be a lot more, like time, like it would work much better timing. Well, like with the amount of time it's taking us to text back and forth, we could do this a lot faster if we just had a conversation and figured out what we want, or we
Right.
could get clear. Like, to me, I can't, like, if I have people who call me who want, let's say, because I do distribute product, so will tell me, like, text me back and forth 1,000 times, and I'm just like, pick up the phone and tell me what you want, because otherwise there's confusion and, something happens or whatever. And I'm just like, sometimes just have a conversation and look at the conversations you do have. Like, there's always opportunity. Like, you're great at this, Bill, with going into meeting strangers and having a conversation, and whether that conversation might just be a good morning and have a good day. But, that goes a long way too.
Yeah, and along those lines, I learned the most from the ones that fail, Like some people are just not on Bill's level at that time of day or whatever it is, but
Exactly.
starts to become a game for me in terms of how can I twist myself up, to get into their world. But with all of that said, and honoring our commitment at the beginning of this time here to give you all a power packed, protein rich, probably soy based because we do have a vegan, a point of view here by half of the crew. Let's just say that there's a lot to be enjoyed in life out there that you and I are kind of like glossing over from time to time. And gee whiz, wouldn't it be really cool if we could stop and pick up some of the gold that's actually falling on the ground and just really appreciate the moment we're in? Just saying, what if,
Absolutely. I think that sometimes, yeah, pause, breathe. It's like when I sit there and I just observe the kids, it's just like, just watch, observe, and because the people around you or the things that happen around you are such opportunities for learning always. Right. I never take situations like that for granted.
Well, I think with that said, we're going to wrap. Going to say, first of all, I love you, Jan. I love you, all of you listeners. And we are lighting the candle, a world that works, and one conversation at a time. We're just doing what we can to make life more enjoyable and more fulfilling, maybe, or just more present and more, we're in it, kind of a deal rather than surviving it, if you will. So
absolutely.
With that said, I'll wish you all adieu. Bye-bye for now. Miss Jan.
Bye-bye, Bill.
All right. Bless you all. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch every episode as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.